Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Today we're going to do a review of the autobiography of Booker T. Washington, Up From Slavery. We're doing chapter 1, inshallah. So, Up From Slavery, the title of chapter 1 is A Slave Among Slaves. Born on a plantation in Franklin County, Virginia, Booker is not sure of the exact place or the date where he was born. He was born near Hales Ford in 1958 or 1959. He doesn't know the month or the day. He writes, quote, "The earliest impression I can now recall are of the plantation and the slave quarters, the latter being the part of the plantation where the slaves had their cabins," end quote. Booker's life began in what he calls, quote, "the most miserable, desolate, and discouraging surroundings," end quote. Booker lived in a cabin with his mother and a brother and sister until after the Civil War, when the slaves were declared free. And I found that to be April 1865. Booker knows almost nothing about his ancestry. He heard about the tortures which the slaves, including his ancestors, suffered in the Middle Passage while being taken from Africa to America. He wasn't able to find history beyond his mother. His mother had a half-brother and a half-sister. He knows less about his father than his mother. He didn't know his father's name. His father wasn't interested in him, but Booker holds no grudge against his father. He writes, quote, "He was simply another unfortunate victim of the institution which the nation unhappily had grafted upon it at that time," end quote. Booker's mother was the plantation cook. They lived in a cabin that had windows, a door, a cat hole, dirt floors, and sweet potato storage. They cooked by making a small fire in the cabin. Booker writes, quote, "While the poorly built cabin caused us to suffer with cold in the winter, the heat from the open fireplace in the summer was equally trying," end quote. Booker's mother only had time to care for him early in the morning and late at night. This was before and after she had to work on the plantation. One of Booker's earliest memories was, quote, "that of my mother cooking a chicken late at night and awakening her children for the purpose of feeding them," end quote. This was technically theft, the fact that his mother stole a chicken from their slave master, but Booker felt that his mother was a victim of circumstances, and he writes, quote, "She was simply a victim of the system of slavery," end quote. Booker slept on a bundle of rags with his brother John and sister Amanda. There was no period of his life devoted to play. He writes, quote, "Almost every day of my life had been occupied in some kind of labor," end quote. He wasn't big enough for hard labor. He cleaned the yard, carried water, and moved corn. He mentions how the bags were heavy and how he cried. He was frightened by the forest. He had heard stories of deserted soldiers cutting off Negro ears. Booker got no schooling while he was a slave. He writes, quote, "The picture of several dozen boys and girls in a schoolroom engaged in study made a deep impression on me, and I had a feeling that to get into a schoolhouse and study in this way would be about the same as getting into paradise," end quote. Booker first became aware of freedom and slavery one morning when his mother was praying for Lincoln to win the war so that they could be free. Booker didn't understand how slaves in the South were aware of the freedom movement. He writes, quote, "In this connection, I have never been able to understand how the slaves throughout the South, completely ignorant as were the masses so far as books or newspaper were concerned, were able to keep themselves accurately and completely informed about the great national questions that were agitating the country," end quote. He continues, quote, "They understood the situation and kept themselves informed by what was termed the grapevine telegraph," end quote. Even when Lincoln was a candidate for presidency, the slaves knew what issues were involved. He writes, quote, "When war was begun between the North and the South, every slave on our plantation felt and knew that though other issues were discussed, the primal one was that of slavery," end quote. There was a colored man who worked with the post office. This allowed slaves to be informed of war battles before whites. Booker's family, so as far as who's winning or losing the battles for the war. Booker's family wasn't able to eat as a family. He writes, quote, I can't remember a single instance during my childhood or early boyhood when our entire family sat down to the table together and God's blessing was asked, and the family ate a meal in a civilized manner, end quote. They ate what scraps they could, and they ate with their hands. Booker's highest aspirations at the time was to eat ginger cakes like the whites. Booker talks about how the war began to affect the food supplies. The slaves were able to eat their food, which was pork and cornbread, but the sugar, coffee, and tea that the whites were accustomed to became scarce. Booker's first pair of shoes were wooden. They were an inch thick with a leather top. The shoes were uncomfortable and awkward looking. Booker hated wearing what was called a flak shirt. He writes, quote, the most trying ordeal that I was forced to endure as a slave boy, however, was the wearing of a flak shirt. So look up what a flak shirt is, because I know I had to look it up myself. The flax they used was the cheap, rough leftovers. Booker writes, quote, I can scarcely imagine any torture except perhaps the pulling of a tooth that is equal to that caused by putting on a new flax shirt for the first time, end quote. His older brother would wear the new flax shirts to break them in for Booker. Negroes in the South that were treated decent were not bitter towards whites fighting to keep slavery. They talk about the sadness amongst the slaves because of the death of Master's Billy. They talked about how some slaves had nursed Billy and others had played with him. He writes, quote, slaves were just as anxious to assist the nursing as the family relatives, end quote. So he's talking about Billy and how slaves were willing to help Billy. Slaves would have given their lives to protect the women and children while men were at war. Slaves would have provided for the masters financially, educationally, and economically if needed. Booker tells the story of a freed slave who paid his former slave master to buy him back, even though he was not required. Booker says, with everything being said, he has never seen a slave who didn't want to be free or one who would return to slavery. Booker writes, quote, I pity from the bottom of my heart any nation or people that is so unfortunate as to get entangled in the net of slavery, end quote. Booker held no bitterness against whites who enslaved his race. He says, quote, we must acknowledge that notwithstanding the cruelty and moral wrong of slavery, the 10 million Negroes who inhabited this country, who themselves or whose forefathers went through the school of American slavery, are in a stronger and more helpful condition materially, intellectually, morally, and religiously than is true of any equal number of black people in any other portion of the globe, end quote. Booker condemns the institution of slavery as selfish financial motivations. Booker had tremendous faith for the future of our race. Booker believes that, quote, the black man got nearly as much out of slavery as the white man did, end quote. Labor was seen as a badge of degradation. Booker writes, quote, the slave system in our place, in a large measure, took the spirit of self-reliance and self-help out of the white people, end quote. He says, none of the slave master's children, quote, ever mastered a single trade or special line of productive industry, end quote. Booker says, quote, when freedom came, the slaves were almost as well fitted to begin life anew as the master, except in the matter of book learning and ownership of property, end quote. Few blacks were unwilling to work at that time. Finally, the war closed and the day of freedom came. It was something they expected. Booker writes, quote, freedom was in the air and had been for months, end quote. They sang songs about freedom that took on a new meaning. Booker says the sadness of Master's family was not due to losing slaves, but losing those they raised. A U.S. officer read the Emancipation Proclamation, or what he thinks it was, the Emancipation Proclamation, what Booker thinks it was. Booker says, quote, my mother, who was standing beside me, leaned over and kissed her children, while tears of joy ran down her cheeks. She explained to us what it all meant, that this was the day for which she had been so long praying, but fearing that she would never live to see, end quote. The happiness lasted for a short time once they realized the responsibility of being free. having to think and plan for the children and for yourself. Booker says, quote, "It was very much like turning a youth of 10 or 12 years into the world to provide for himself," end quote. He continues, quote, "To some it seemed that now that they were in actual possession of it, freedom was a more serious thing than they had expected to find it," end quote. It was hard for blacks to part with their former slave masters. Some old slaves even stayed with their slave masters. And that's the end of chapter 1. Make sure you share this if you like what you heard. Comment if you disagree with anything I said. I will probably donate to Tuskegee University if you want to give back to Booker T. Washington. Appreciate everybody for coming through, looking. Make sure you read the chapter, read the book for yourself, and form your own opinion. And I'll see y'all in chapter 2. Peace out, y'all.